Okay, my name is Thom Field. I am an associate professor at City University in Seattle and am the conference chair and the president-elect of WACES. I am interested in this topic just because I see the movement in the field towards this, and I think integration is actually very important for counseling because I think that's one of the ways that we can engage in more preventative care, which is one of the kind of hallmarks of who we are as a profession.
Leah Brew, and I'm at Cal State Fullerton. I'm a professor and the department chair. I also sit on the Board of Behavioral Sciences, which licenses LMFTs, LPCCs, social workers, and licensed educational psychologists. So some of my knowledge is also from the state board perspective. And I want to qualify with maybe this is the trend that we're going to. With our election this week, we have no idea where we'll land.
Thanks, Leah.
I'm Michelle Ghoston, and I'm with Gonzaga University. As Thom mentioned, I'm also the director of our site-based Canadian programs. I, too, believe that we have to prepare our students for working what I believe is multiple settings and to do multiple things. And the story that best comes in my brain as I, too, have begun to transition into teaching more of our clinical courses is just getting them to communicate outside of their box of being a counselor. And I remember students coming to me saying, I'm doing a lot of case management. And I thought, yes. And they thought, that's not what I'm supposed to do. Like that, and that was their frame of mind. Like, I'm not supposed to be the person on the phone. And so helping them understand that's what we do.
I'm Keely Hope. I am an associate professor at Eastern Washington University. I'm also the program director for the counselor education program there. I'm also the president of WACES this year. I am interested in this for probably just to echo some of the points that have already been said, and I will go one further, is I'm also interested in one, being able to collaborate. So I think it's important for students really to understand the language that we speak. How do we communicate with other professionals? I think that's really important. What do other professionals do and how can they help our clients? But I'm also really interested in how do we also protect our professional identity as counselors as well, all the while doing all of these other things. So I think that's important.
I'm Ashley Luedke. I am an assistant professor at the University of Nevada, Reno. I'm also our field placement coordinator, so obviously this is pretty important to me because it's helping to determine some great placement opportunities for both our MFC students as well as our CMH students as we carry all three tracks in our program. One of the things that's interesting for me is not only the traditional model of integrated behavioral health, but also starting to do that integration within other systems as well, such as within the school district system, and starting to get clinical mental health counselors a little bit more involved within that system, working with social workers, school counselors, career coaches, and creating that team base within there, since they're such a first line of defense for our adolescents.
Thank you all for introducing yourselves. It's kind of interesting, Keely had mentioned that when she was working in the field, especially working in a more medical setting, it was very collaborative. Mm-hmm. My experiences, and maybe we can almost start off with this and we'll lead into our first prompt. I learned a lot of that on the job. Like this is going to sound horrible, but I didn't learn collaboration while I was a master's student as much as maybe I could have. Would you agree with that or have a different perspective on that?
Going through. I wouldn't say we teach collaboration explicitly, but it's implicitly part of the program in that we, the type of assignments that they have to do, they have to figure out how to work with each other. The students always set up a Facebook page every beginning group, even though they don't go through exactly together. And we're always having to navigate those processes or navigate difficult conversations. So in some ways they learn those skills, well, plus your basic pre-practicum skills help do some of that, right? But no, we don't do it explicitly for sure, but I think they have a foundation that prepares them.
You just kind of flow into it? Do you want more of a popcorn? What do you want?
However you guys want to do it.
I would certainly agree that I don't think in my experience that I was taught how to collaborate or communicate with other professionals in my master's program. I think that I'm maybe this is based on my own experience, but that I'm trying to be more intentional about bringing those conversations into the classroom, and using, I'm teaching the Intro to Mental Health Counseling class right now, and really we're talking a lot about ethics. And I think part of our code of ethics really opens up that conversation about, working with other professionals. And I think that's a great segue into what types of other professionals will you work with. And I always look at it through the lens of ultimately what best serves the client. So what professionals, what conversations can we have in order to really best serve the client at the end of the day?
I don't think I was really taught about collaboration in my program as a master's student either. However, I was in a unique position coming into UNR. The clinical track is fairly new. We're only going through it's our first cohort is graduating this spring from the clinical track. So we were able to really create and define the coursework, not only within the K-CREP standards, but what we saw as being trends in the field. So not only do we have a class that's specifically on consultation, but also in our treatment planning class, our clinical interventions class, and then obviously in the clinical fieldwork classes, that's fully integrated within there. And so who do you need to talk to when you've got this type of client coming in? Who do you need to be working with, and what do those conversations look like? So that we're even doing some role plays within the classes of what those conversations need to look like to really help integrate those skills for them, because it is such a need.
I think about it in two ways. In my master's program, and Thom and I were at the same program at different times, but it feels like that I had an awareness that collaboration was happening with my profs, that they were in the community and that they were doing things, but it wasn't taught in the classroom. So it was like they were doing it, but we never had a conversation about integrating that and how it's important for the well-being and wholeness of the clients. I think now and how we do it, we collaborate in the sense of presentations and making sure they're on board with us. One of our faculty members does a great deal of writing with the students. So I think we collaborate in that sense, but is it directive in the sense of this is necessary for students? I'm not sure that we do that or that I was taught to do that. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah, it's almost like there are some prerequisite skills to collaboration that maybe are getting taught sometimes in a less formal way, such as, students working together, collaborating on a project, or students working with a faculty member, or even observing a faculty member doing something. And then there are also more formal ways that Ashley was talking about, such as a consultation course, where students are kind of prompted to look at collaboration in a more kind of formal way. I think we'll talk probably more about collaboration when we get to the how-to part of this presentation. But I just wanted to kind of follow up on what Keely was saying, because it just struck me immediately that I think collaboration is one of the key skills really for counselors to learn when they're working in medical settings. So we're going to begin with talking about the trend in the field towards integrated behavioral health care. I'll give you just a brief definition of what that is before we start talking about what the trend is. So just as a general idea, integrated behavioral health care essentially is when you have medical services provided in conjunction with or in concurrently or in collaboration with mental health and substance use services. And so that integration of those is what's called integrated behavioral health care. Now it's called behavioral health care versus mental health care because it includes things like substance use treatment. It includes things like developmental disorders and working with those issues. And some community mental health agencies, perhaps where you're working, maybe you're seeing more of this, are starting to do more and more of this, which is they'll have centers that have medical services and dental services and mental health and substance use services all in kind of one center, or they'll have a way of getting clients those services. So that's what we mean by integrated behavioral health care. So we're going to start with discussing the trend in the field towards this. And Leah had already talked about that maybe this is a trend, maybe it isn't a trend. We'll see what happens in the coming months.
It was a trend until Tuesday.
It was a trend until Tuesday.
We don't know.
Right. Maybe would you all just share your thoughts on that, on the trend in the field?
I'll start. So in California, as soon as the Affordable Health Care Act was established, California got on it right away and developed, it's called, I wrote it down because I wouldn't remember, I just think OSHPD, Office of Statewide Health Planning and Development. And I did a little research because we don't have a lot of students working in these facilities. And it turns out the vast majority of them are for substance abuse or diabetes, like over and over and over again. Those were the treatments. Not like we shouldn't be there, but we should. It wasn't until last year that the MFTs were able to get reimbursed for these services. And while some of our students have been in a few places, they've been reluctant because they can't get reimbursed. So now they're starting to reimburse from MFTs, but they didn't add the LPCs. The MFTs in California have a lot of money. They have like 5 lawyers on staff. But the LPCs, we only got the license in 2009. The first licensees are in 2012. Most people still don't know who we are, and a lot of county agencies are reluctant to hire LPCs, and they want to make sure that they can work with children and families, so we have all these additional hoops as LPCs that we have to jump through in our state, because the MFTs wanted to. As you all know, AMPT likes to be sure that we're entirely different professions. I personally don't see it that way. I think of them as a specialization, but they said that if we don't have like these particular minimum requirements, we can't see couples and families. So we're the only state with that restriction, unless we have 500 supervised hours and 2 university courses. So we aren't getting in there as LPCs, but our program is a dual MFT LPCC, so we have some of that going on. There are 3 different types of integrated behavioral health care facilities. One is coordinated, working with different things. I haven't seen as much of that. And then there's co-located, so they're all located in the same place, but they're not doing a lot of case conferencing on each of the clients. That is more popular right now. And then there's the true integrated care where they meet on a regular basis. So for us, I would say we probably have 2 or 3 of our 75 agencies that are doing this. And it's pretty minimal, and like I said, most of them are co-located, so they're not involved in working with other professionals. And my hope was, and continues to be, that we start getting into these and doing more integrated care, because that's, the social workers really have the ownership of this over the other mental health professions in California. So that's kind of our landscape right now.
I think the one setting that has happened for us, especially in Spokane, has been the hospital, which is kind of nice. It was also nice because one of the first therapists they hired was one of ours. So we got to kind of share stories and know. Janice also presented with us when we presented on the Affordable Care Act. So having her lens is actually being in the hospital, doing the therapeutic side of the house, as well as learning kind of about the regulations. And so we have been lucky enough to have a student or 2 kind of continue in that setting and learn about, what is it like to go talk with a young kid who is suffering from cancer, who has a terminal illness and unable to see the mental health side of the house. And as she's training and learning and getting involved, like, how do I do this, right? Because I don't know anything about his medical condition, yet I can see that he's anxious and angry and all that stuff is normal. And how do we help this kid where he is? And so how, I guess, as GU has been involved is that one setting allows a couple of students to be able to work in that. I would say the other spot might be the jail. We tend to have 1 or 2 students placed at the jail, and so just by its very nature, they get to have some work done with the psychiatrist and and they provide a few services, as well as if they're trying to help inmates get settled in the community, then they have to get engaged with, even basic physical living space. So it seems like we have a few places that are just, it's how it's set up, and we've been lucky enough to get some students connected and ultimately hired in those settings. And some of the stories are like really amazing to me. I know someone's in hospice, but they get sit down and from the administrator to come down to see the counselor for some support because they're not sleeping, right? And you're like, well, I might not be sleeping if I was in that space either, but you just don't think to take care of that idea of the whole person, which is important to us as a Jesuit school. So that's how we see it.
So we actually have some overlap because I am also in Spokane or Eastern Washington. There are quite a few sites that are growing and changing, especially in at least the eastern side of the state of Washington. Our largest community healthcare center, I would say there's at least 12 to 15 separate offices of our largest community mental health facility. And so there is a lot of coordinated healthcare that's going on, and they are being really, again, mindful of bringing in physicians and bringing in dentists to actually work with the clients, the clients that are being seen in their Medicaid population, by and large. We also have, and I'm very proud of this fact, but we have student interns of the VA, and they are perhaps probably one of the best in terms of integrated behavioral health care. I have two student interns there now who are at the medical center, and so they have easy access to all of the services that the VA provides. And then they also do part of their internship in the homeless outreach as well. And so that's actually a great place for them to be, and I'm pretty excited that we've been able to have interns at the VA, and now we have a new hire right out of her master's program, now working for the VA. We also have another agency in town that's a youth center that's really working on their wraparound services, and there's a school, they have substance abuse treatment, they have a residential center, they've just expanded their center in terms of providing that gap in foster care. So now they have money to have individuals who between 18 and 21 who might still be in school, they can then stay. And so they have a place to live, whereas before they might not have had that. So we actually do have interns in all of these places, and so we do get to have a really great conversation with how does all of this work, and who are the individuals that you're working with. So sometimes it's not even just other professionals and understanding where they're coming from, their training models, but even paraprofessionals, and how do we talk to paraprofessionals about mental health care. And when you spoke about the jail, that's a place that stands out for me, as we have interns at the jail also, communicating with law enforcement and helping advocate for our clients. And so I think it's there. I think it's how much exposure do we have and how much information do we have to teach our students about all the other people that they're working with as well.
I had a little bit of a culture shock coming to Nevada. I'm from the East Coast. I'm from New York. And then I spent some time in Florida. And so very different approaches to mental health in both of those states. I was involved in a couple different agencies that utilized the integrative model very efficiently, and there were a lot of resources for it. And then I moved to Nevada. And Nevada is actually very similar to California.
Second to the last state to get
yes, we often refer to ourselves as California's little sister, and that we will do whatever California says. So we also just recently got the CPC license only a few years ago. There's very few CPCs in our area. However, we just had a huge win for us in that for our board, the new board president is a CPC.
Nice.
Yeah, so we're very excited about that because there's a lot of resistance to CPCs in the field, and a lot of, well, what can you really do? And for us, we have the same thing. It's 5 extra classes and 500 hours before we can see families or couples. So it's very limited and very restrictive on what CPCs in the state of Nevada are allowed to do. I can't speak too much about Southern Nevada, but in Northern Nevada, we only have 2 facilities that are accessible that utilize the integrative model. There's a few others, but again, they're the substance only aspect of it. And within that, so I've been doing a lot of going out into the field, trying to advocate for the profession, show what we can do, meeting with these different agencies to help show the merit of having a CPC on site to assist with what's going on in their offices and meet the mental health care needs of our residents in Nevada, as we don't do very well with mental health care in our state at all. The resources are very hard to find. Part of the problem is that in Northern Nevada, we're very spread out. Once you get out of Washoe County and into the outskirts of Washoe County, you can go 2 hours before you see another human being. So we face that challenge as well, because then, how do they get those services? How do they know what's even available? So that's part of what I've been doing, is trying to help see how can we link these services a little bit more. And I think some of that does fall on us, and part of our advocating role of going out and saying, this is what we can do. And this is how we can be helpful. I had the good fortune that one of the models that I'm used to is out of Buffalo, New York. And I had a moment of pride when the pediatrician's office was actually featured by ACA a little over a year ago, because an article had been written about this pediatrician's office, and I actually had worked with them when they first started launching the model of integrated care there. And they are one of the few that actually do full counseling sessions. So when the client comes in, well, at that point it's a patient, comes in to see the pediatrician with the parents' concerns about their child, they're actually bringing them right to the counselor and doing a full counseling session, not just a quick 5, 10, 15-minute assessment. So I think that's things that we can help with guiding as far as the trends go.
Go ahead. I was going to say, can we ask some questions before we change topics?
Absolutely.
I was just going to say, I too hail from the East Coast, crazy state of Virginia, but anyway, where I call home. I remember there the wraparound services being a major deal for foster care kids. And so I remember at times being the behavior specialist for a while, then I was the counselor for the foster care parents, and then I was in the schools with them, and I remember that just being so valuable. I understood this kid from a place of what his systems looked like, what his internal, external worlds look like at home, at school, in the court. So I could much better on the basketball court, yes, is where I wanted to do my work, talk to him about what's affecting all around him versus just, you got kicked out of school again. And so it just made working, and so it felt like in Virginia it was a big deal, a big push with children, trying to keep them out of the system, or even if they had to step into foster care briefly, that we were working to get you back home, and that meant services for mom and dad and nieces and nephews, everybody who's in that house, we had to help support. And so that's kind of how I see that idea of integrative work from that lens. Back to my current role in Spokane, there's been some grants that's been allowed in the school system that allows mental health in addition to the school counselors. And so that's been a major deal, where a lot of times we have our school counselors placed at the school alongside their peers who are doing the mental health work. And so, one, to get school counselors to understand that you do a lot of mental health work, because a lot of times the school counselors are like, no, we just do this. No, you really do a lot of this. You may not have the time to sit for 40 minutes, but your colleague downstairs can do a 30, 40-minute session. So that feels like that integration. I hope that grant money becomes permanent, but at least the state is getting some of those funds to help.
We're not allowed to ask questions.
We'll get there, don't worry.
Just some things that you all said that I was thinking, wow, our world is so different in California. So one is in the jails, it's just psychologists. Only psychologists get the jails, nobody else gets them. In the hospitals, they don't want to take our students because we require video recordings of sessions, and they won't allow any recordings of sessions whatsoever. And even a lot of the agencies we struggle with because of the CAQREP requirement of doing individual and group supervision, or even if they only have a couple of clients, they're not willing to spend the money on that. So we really, I mean, in some ways there's a lot of money, and in some ways there's limited resources that they're all fighting for constantly in trying to do that. And I wondered if, Nevada had some of the same kind of situations.
Very much so. We actually, one of the first placements that we got for our clinical mental health students was with the Northern Nevada Adult Mental Health Services, which is an integrative hospital, actually. And so they have the regular hospital there, then they also have the mental health hospital. They provide, they have physicians there, psychiatrists there. And then they initially contacted us because they wanted some of our marriage and family counseling students to come intern. And so I said, how about some clinical mental health? And they said, what is that? And so that was, part of the
we're dealing with that
piece.
all the time.
Yeah.
They don't know who we are. What is a counselor? They have no clue.
It was when I started meeting some people and they saw my credentials were LMHC out of Florida, they're what is that? And what are you doing in Nevada? And I said, it's cool, we're here, we're called CPCs, same thing. It's new, but don't be afraid. And
we're really
okay.
well trained.
Yeah, and that was what it, so I actually have to have full meetings on what does our curriculum look like, because are we actually as good as an MFC? And I'm like, they're being taught by the same people. So yes, it's all the same faculty. But going down and providing that education piece, and I think that's the hardest battle that I think probably both of us are facing in Nevada and California, that our students are hearing. We're finally starting to meld away some of that because it even was trickling down into our program, where our students were, no, we're better. And it's like, you're all fantastic. Let's remember why we got into this field. And there's room for all of us in the sandbox because, let's be honest,
there's plenty of need.
There's so much need, and it's not being, it's not being adequately addressed as it is now.
Yeah, one of the things that we just passed legislation last year, we finally talked our board into certifying LPCCs that they meet the criteria to see couples and families, so that they could, so that the agencies, especially the county agencies, would feel comfortable hiring our people to say that yes, they can work with anybody. They're fine.
And didn't we have this struggle at some point with social workers? Oh, yeah. It's still okay.
Yeah.
We're still fighting them too.
They're still there.
Yeah. In Washington State, we recently passed a regulation that mental health professionals can include social workers, but also now marriage and family therapists and mental health counselors with an associate level license, whereas before it required 2 years of experience out of school. And that was prohibitive for students because some students would graduate without that experience and wouldn't be able to be hired at agencies to bill Medicaid or do certain functions under Medicaid. And so that was just a recent passage, even in Washington State. I was hearing from what you all were sharing that there are not only differences at the state level in how the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act is being implemented, so how, for example, integration happens and the degree to which it happens, but also how things like counselor licensure law, understanding and knowledge of counselors, how that is going to impact integration, the degree to which counselors can get into integrated care settings.
I think that not only exists at that level, but also exists with the client, with just regular, with everyone. There's a misperception of what is counseling. And, I think there's this idea of it's that old traditional get on the couch, tell me how you feel. And sometimes it even happens with our students when they come in. And so we have to have this conversation of what do you think counseling is? Okay, now let's throw that away and let's talk about what counseling really is. And I think that conversation needs to happen not only with that, but also within these sites that we're going into to start that education within the community that counseling is a really great thing. And it's not about being sick or being less than. It's about how do we make ourselves even better? And how do we live the life that we want to live? And how do we maintain that wellness? And I think when we can flip that perspective, that'll also help for just our country as a whole about the idea of mental health care in general.
I think moving into the next kind of prompt, which has to do with, the how-to, what knowledge and skills are required of students. Some of you have mentioned that some of your interns are being hired or interning at facilities that have integrated care models. I know my experience has been that some students feel very mixed about kind of engaging with the medical model. So would you all just kind of discuss that a little bit, if you've noticed that come up at all?
I haven't noticed that they're concerned as much as it is having to continually reinforce what counseling is on our end, because sometimes what will happen is interns or students will get out in the field and sort of forget because they're being exposed to or working with other individuals. And so it's the continual reinforcement of this is who we are and where we're coming from, valuing the other person's experience, understanding the other person's professional experience, but also then not, one, competing with them, or really forgetting what you're learning as a counselor and then going and only doing this as well. I find my biggest struggle is when I have students who are working with other professionals, especially if they're the other professional as a supervisor, it's you're throwing your own professional identity or your budding professional identity not out the window, so to speak, but you're putting it aside in order to make sure that your supervisor likes you. And so then there's the, where does that all fit in? So that's the struggle that I'm facing more.
We're trying to navigate that line between asserting yourself and advocating for the client with the medical professionals while also remaining really respectful. And I think that's something we're trying to do more explicitly with students in terms of, okay, what does professionalism look like? How do you talk to people in a way that's respectful? How do you use your, pre-practicum skills of, okay, reflect and validate their perspective, and then you still have to assert your own side. And, so many of them feel like they have an imposter syndrome in the first place. So you've got the half who has the imposter syndrome and won't say anything, and then you've got this other end of the continuum who are a little bit lack some humility. For us, it's like trying to get everybody sort of in the middle of that to be able to work with the other professionals and also have role flexibility, I think, with clients too, that some of you guys have mentioned.
I just feel like I just had conversations in our pre-prac on campus and site-based. How do they stand their ground? So I'm thinking of situations where they're co-leading groups, and they go in and there are people that have positions and have titles, and they've been doing this for years, and they're like, that's not how we were trained. Wait, you're not helping them process what's really happening. So then they get fearful of titles, be it medical or otherwise, to say, wait, how do I integrate myself without being disrespectful? How do I reconcile a bit that maybe my way is not perfect either? And so then how do I integrate then with even a different style? And so then I think oftentimes what they come back and do, and they either say, this is right, this is wrong. So we try to, let's talk about that. What are elements that work and what are elements that feel more comfortable for you? And I'll use my term here. Eventually you find your own swag and place to be, but recognizing that everyone in the field is not going to have your same lens, your same perspective, and that's okay. But how to have your own space and be respectful, yet you have something to offer. Mm-hmm. That's why you're there. And hopefully they can hear that on the other side. But I think it's hard with titles and especially years of experience. So they'll say, but this person's been doing this for 20 years. And that's great. However, there's people in the field that's been doing this for 20 years that need some brush up occasionally. Don't you say it that way. However, how do you integrate what you know and still respect what they're doing? I think the power is that they can see the difference. They can say, gosh, this doesn't seem to be working with this client, because then the therapy we provide as clinicians must be tailored to who's sitting in front of me. not just because this is my perspective. So I think there's value in them being able to say, gosh, I wonder if we did this and did it in this way, or if we got the clients this. You know, one of my students works at a meth center, and so when she talks about all the services they provide, I think don't get so focused on just what this one clinician's doing in their title. Think of your global system of what you're doing, which is so awesome.
I know that on a national level, there's some concern and some of the knowledge needs are about understanding the medical model a little bit better, learning more about brief interventions within the clinical training program, because in some of these sites where there's integrative care, they're only getting the clients for 10, 15 minutes. And so they get in there, and this is something my own students have faced of, what do I do in 10 minutes? Like, that's just relationship. And so that's something I know. And then there's also the fear of, what drugs are they talking about, and understanding psychotropic medication, and even just regular medication, that, well, what is this and what does this do, and how might this potentially be impacting what we're seeing. And so I know there's been some questions from some of our students about getting some more of that during their time with us, that I know I'm starting to look at being able to provide for them. Specifically with my students, one of the things that they faced was they were seeing, like, one of them had a client that they saw for 2 weeks in a row for a brief amount of time, about 20 minutes, and then the case manager and the physician came in and said, it's been 2 weeks, I've seen no change with this client. Oh. and my poor student was like, deer in headlights, full imposter syndrome at this point, like, oh my God, what did I do wrong? And then they came in and I was like, it's okay. Remember, if this were a regular client, would you really see change in 2 weeks?
And in 40 minutes.
Yeah,
Some total
probably not. So encouraging them to have those conversations with the case managers, with the doctors there, about the change process, the stages of change, and how it takes time to build that therapeutic relationship so that we can even get to that point. I think those are some of the things that I know we're starting to focus on within our program.
We have a psychopharmacology course.
Yeah, unfortunately we don't at this point.
I recommend it.
Yeah. We have one through...
I took it myself.
We have one through our addictions program, which is a separate program, not part of ours, that we encourage all of our students to take. But right now, with the way the program is structured, and we're locked in because we're waiting for our first K-CREP to come through for our clinical track, but the rest of them have the accreditation. So we're like just waiting patiently until everything comes through before we can make any formal adjustments. But I think that's on the list of considerations. Well, at least I hope it is.
We try to combine the two, but since our new prof is sitting here, she'll figure that out from going forward. But we've tried to do a psychopathology, psychopharm kind of integration in the classroom.
That's a lot.
That's all.
Yeah, we do. I teach it in the DSM class, but it's pretty minimal.
Yeah. I teach it over, I have 2 quarters. I teach it over 20 weeks. I do psychopath and psychopharm because it's very, very hard to do in a couple weeks.
Yeah, that's tough. We have a full 3-unit course,
Yeah.
and most, like the first quarter of it is learning the brain-based stuff and understanding neurotransmitters and the whole physiology. And we do that same physiology in our addictions course as well, so they get that double.
I do that in my crisis class.
Ashley had mentioned the 15, 20-minute consultation meetings, which are fairly kind of controversial, right? This idea of what can you do in 15, 20 minutes. Did you all want to share some perspectives on that?
We haven't had that problem.
At my last program in Florida, we actually were teaching them a specific technique, CBASP, where it's like meant to be a very brief intervention that can be done in under 20 minutes. So we were teaching them that to utilize as kind of like keep in their back pocket when all else fails, go to this. And that was very helpful for a lot of our students, although in the moment they hated it. Because it was so structured and they were like, this is terrible, we don't want to ask all of these steps. But then later on after they graduate, they'd be like, all right, well, I don't use the whole thing, but sometimes I use steps of it. And when we do only have those 15, 20 minutes, utilizing something that is very structured can be really helpful with helping to facilitate the change.
So I suppose I have a few thoughts on it. We haven't really had a lot of students that are coming to us with having to do that. I think I've had one that's been challenged with having fairly minimal sessions, and she was in what was called an adult recovery services, so that it was more clinical case management than what I would call traditional counseling. We have since changed things around and not really allowing interns to go there anymore because we really want them to have the actual traditional counseling experience. But I see some value in having some of those brief interactions, depending on the nature of the client, depending on how often they need to be seen. So I think that there's probably a middle ground somewhere that we haven't quite got to, but perhaps it's not for students in terms of in a training experience. That wouldn't be positive. So, you know, I sort of sit with both because they end up doing that when they graduate. So knowing how to interact and knowing how to manage a 20 to 30 minute session, I think is important, but how do we get there from, you know, training to what the outcome is? We have a lot of push in, at least where we are, from some of our sites that are going to what they're calling clinician models. And so they're essentially saying, oh, but we're all the same. All the clinicians are the same, which on some level I can understand and value, but also your training is different and what you're trying to get with an internship is also very different. So it's educating those individuals on yes, but, or yes, and. We need something a little bit different.
But isn't that what our school counselors do? Like, don't they?
Yeah, our school
Yeah.
counselors do it, not an integrated behavioral health.
Right,
They do
not-
about 30-minute sessions.
That's what they
It's
have
a
to do.
lucky.
Yeah, and sometimes it's 5-10 minutes.
Mhm.
Yeah. So that's kind of what is expected of them, just because of the nature of their setting. And so I think for us, it's almost the opposite. Like when we're training for the 45-minute sessions, our school counselors are like, but I don't have that.
I can't fill out
Can you-
45 minutes.
can
What are
you-
you talking
Can
about?
you break it down for like, what would that look like in 20 minutes? So in the pre-prac section that I have now, I co-teach that with the school person, and we practice both. We practice with the marriage and family folks what 40 and 45-minute couple sessions look like, and what a 20-minute session would look like with student, parent, whomever, mainly the student, but you might have those with guardians and doctors and
Yeah, I think our short sessions, in addition to schools, are also at DV shelters, right? But they can see them multiple times a week, so they somehow feel like that need is still getting met.
Yeah. Or hospitals maybe too might be a shorter, but it's 3 times a week, so then it feels like, oh, I got an hour this week.
Yeah, yeah.
Versus,
It's my own clinical experience lends itself to, you know, what I have done for many, many years is crisis intervention. So, you know, going in, triaging, connecting quickly, stabilizing, and moving forward. Sort of where my mind has lived for many, many years. So I know that it can be done, but again, it's the training module that's really, how much is somebody getting out of that?
Well, those are two different intentions, though, right?
Absolutely,
Like
yeah.
crisis work is different than, and so we have a whole separate crisis
Right.
class
Right.
to say, okay, sometimes that's what you're doing, and then other times you get to do what I like to call real therapy.
The luxury of time.
Yes.
I think so far we've talked about some of the knowledge and skills that are required, I think, for counselors who are going to be working in integrated behavioral healthcare settings. We've talked about collaboration. We've talked a bit about crisis management and being able to do crisis work. We've also talked about self-advocacy, how that's a really important component. Michelle kind of briefly mentioned on having a systems awareness when she was doing work in Virginia. Would you all like to expand on either of those themes or maybe some additional that we haven't talked about yet?
I think systems for me probably was part of my training. I was trained by another MFT, and that, so I think that's just how I base almost everything, and the idea that whoever's sitting in front of me is not, it's not all to the program, right? And so I just think of it when you're working with an addict, you can get them to a point of saying, this is not healthy for me, but if they go right back to a setting, right, where there's, you know, drinking and all those other things, and they're going to go right back to where it is. So for me, it's just a way of being versus a way of trying to integrate. That is just, in my opinion, it's impossible to not work from a systems approach, from the lens of integration, and just, it's my own belief about humans, so.
I think they're inherently connected. I mean, if you think about what the idea of integrated healthcare really is, it really is connecting all of the systems and looking at all the places where a person can be served and how much does their physical health really fit in with their mental health, and their mental health fit in with their physical health, and how much of that then is job related, and all of these things really do have to fit together. We think about it as, again, going back to best serving the client, who is the client as an entire person, and how do all of these things fit together. I think that's inherently system.
And also with looking at the providers and that system within itself, and how do we function as a system to best help that client. So really applying it to both sides of that lens, I think, is pretty critical.
Yeah, we look at the microsystem as well as the macro system, family, and then I want to kind of pull in another skill, which is the cultural competency. Not just race and ethnicity, but social class is huge, and LGBTQ is growing. So integrating those pieces and the experiences of oppression and discrimination, and so many of our agencies that our students are going to are working with undocumented immigrants. We're developing a Spanish-speaking track for students because we don't have any Spanish-speaking supervisors. We have faculty who can do the supervision, and we've created sections of practicum for anyone who's doing therapy in Spanish, but it's kind of frightening to think at their agencies they're working in other languages and there's no supervisor who can really understand what's going on or watch videos and get it. So we have a lot of Spanish, Vietnamese, Korean, and Chinese clients, and so we're trying to recruit more students and do more therapy in multiple languages and recruit instructors to do the supervision who are, bilingual in those languages to be able to navigate that piece. It's huge. It's, I would say the English-speaking population in integrated behavioral health is like 10%. It's the vast majority. English is at least a second language if they speak it at all.
I think we have time for maybe one more prompt, and then we'll take some questions from the audience. One of the things that I've been kind of chewing on about integrated behavioral health care has been the relationship between mental health and substance use treatment, what that looks like to be integrated together. I'll give you an example. In Washington State recently, there was legislation passed that makes it easier for licensed mental health professionals, not just counselors, social workers, marriage and family therapists, nurse practitioners, physicians, to become what's called chemical dependency professionals, which is a separate designation in Washington State. So there's kind of a movement, at least at Washington State and the state level, to get people more qualified to provide integrated services. And I've been kind of thinking about what that means. Like, there are definitely courses that are identified by the state in terms of what you need to have training-wise. But I also wanted to get your thoughts on what you think counselors need to know if they're providing services to people who have addictions, who have what we call concurrent or comorbid or dual diagnosis issues.
Well, I have a lot to say about that.
Yeah.
So in California, this is my 5th year on the licensure board. Every year, the chemical dependency folks are trying to get their own license, and I think they're trying to do it for insurance reimbursement purposes. But their they can't step on our toes, and we as a board don't want them because we're already busy enough. We have 105,000 licensees right now. But the requirements are not rigorous enough, so they're not allowed to work with dual diagnose people, but then they don't have to take a DSM course to determine if somebody might be to refer out. And it's like, have you met many addicts who aren't dual diagnosed? I mean, typically there's a lot more going on than just the addiction. So we're constantly trying to either fight it and not have them get their license, or if they do, they need to add more rigor. And then they're trying to keep us out, and I mean us by all the other mental health licensees, which ABA is doing, right, with the behavioral analysis. They're also trying to do the same thing. And it's like, wait a minute, we are more than qualified. And we do have an addictions course, and we integrate addictions in lots of other courses, including DSM and crisis and everything. So I think our students are very well qualified to work with this population, and I think it's better that they're not all recovering addicts. Like, I find that in the agencies where recovering addicts are working with other people trying to go through recovery, they have that Minnesota model that's so humiliating and so negative, whereas we push motivational interviewing on them. It's very frustrating for us in California because they are getting licensed across the country, but how they are so not qualified to work with the type of issues that these clients have.
It's similar, even though Thom suggested that there has been a lot of movement and positive movement in Washington. That was one of the things that I was taken aback when I got to Washington about 7 years ago, is I came with a license in Florida and a license in Ohio, where I can provide substance abuse or chemical dependency treatment with no additional qualification, because I have that, or a lot of us are trained in that. And then when I got to Washington, it's very different in the sense that now I need an additional certification, but that additional certification can be given to those with an associate's degree.
Yeah.
So
Very.
there is a level of frustration that goes with that, because I know that our students are more than qualified to be able to do that effectively, I think. But I think the two go hand in hand. I mean, quite honestly, mental health care and substance abuse treatment, I think they go hand in hand. And I think it's an important place to begin in terms of integrated health care. I think that's the most natural integrated health care that we do as counselors. But there's other pieces that fit into that as well. I'm thinking, this is not quite the same, but eating disorders as well. Thinking about making sure that we're adequately training individuals in all of these places.
Well, and I think it aligns with the addictive behaviors.
Yes,
right? That could
yes,
be
very
sex
much so.
Process
which
addiction,
we see a lot
yeah.
of.
Yep.
We see gambling, right? And so then that falls into our students qualified. I think they're definitely qualified. I think it's, again, getting them to have their own voice and finding their space of, do you want further certification in this? Because you're trained to do this. If you choose to now be certified, we have a couple students that left and they wanted to be certified as on sex addictions. And so then you have a core now, and now go get additional training. That's if you want to specialize, but you shouldn't have to. And so now if you have to go out in the field and re-justify yourself, especially if there's others that don't, it's a hard sell, but we also, I think, have to empower our students to be able to speak from. After you see that first client, you can no longer say, I've never done this before.
Right.
Like, you cannot say that, right? You can say, I'm still learning, I'm still, right? And then you have to consult over and over again, but we do that throughout our careers, right? So I may not have 20 years of experience with this, but gosh, I can reach out to my colleagues. And so because I have a good foundation, I can go to my colleagues, I can get that support, and I can still be a benefit. And if I can't benefit this client, then ethically I have to. So they have that core, and they have the training, and they can get more if they want it. So the answer to me is yes, they're qualified.
In Nevada, they also have the license, and they can get it with just their bachelor's degree, and it's a minor in their bachelor's degree, which for me, when I think about my bachelor's degree, I had a minor in English and criminal justice.
You should be able to be a lawyer.
Yeah. I mean, and that's kind of what it feels like to me, is that I had a minor in CJ so I can go be a lawyer now. And I mean, I think I could probably do a good argument, but I don't know that I'd really do a great job at executing factual law terminology and referencing appropriately. And so there's like a student in one of our classes right now who she did the minor, and she's working in the field with substance, And she'll tell me about some of the things that she's doing, and I just stop and I go, that is so, you don't have enough training, because she'll even say to me,
Yes.
I don't know what I'm doing.
Yeah.
And I'm like,
And they're
you're right,
hard
you
cases
don't
a
know
lot
what
of
you're
times.
doing.
Exactly.
And I'm like, I'm so glad you're here now, getting the training that you
Yeah.
really need to be able to do this, because it's terrifying to me that it's a minor in a bachelor's degree to be able to work with these populations, and they're doing work that our clinical mental health and our marriage and family counselors are more than qualified to be doing. So we actually encourage all of our clinical mental health students to go ahead and get the certificate as a graduate student in addiction, so that they can see both populations, because as it stands right now, they can only work with someone who has a substance if the focus isn't on the substance, unless they have the license.
Similar.
Which, I mean, to me, that's
It's
kind
crazy.
of, it's almost reminiscent of the idea of you can't see, I mean, there's, I don't know, it's very
You're trying to
bizarre.
determine which one comes first, right? Like, so
Right.
They may not lead
Right.
with that.
The
They
chicken or the egg, who
Right, they
knows?
come in with this, and then you realize, oh, there's such, wait, that's the
Yeah.
primary issue now. Oh, I can't see you anymore. Like,
Yeah.
And it's like, how do you
That's
ever
ludicrous.
determine that, unless you can somehow like click back into their mind of when did they take that first substance,
Right.
and what was going on before it? So was it just the desire to get high, or to?
Is it that family they grew up in?
Right, exactly, and you know, the chicken or egg debate.
Yes, yeah, and I find that the argument is the same with applied behavioral analysis as well, like this need for additional training. So many of our students are working in those fields already with their undergraduate degrees, and I don't know if you find this too. Then they come in through our program, even the ones doing ABA, which is very structured and behavioral, right? And then they're like, wow, using my pre-practicum skills, you know, just that alone, just that one class, I'm so much better. And then they take culture and they're like, oh, wow, my clients are getting better faster. And I'm like, see? Like, I need to do research. I just don't have enough time. I need to publish something, because it's really clear that what we do so better prepares them to work with all different kinds of populations and issues. Yeah.
Yeah. It's interesting. It sounds like we're doing a lot of hoop jumping still, right? That kind of unnecessary. I'm getting a sense from the panel that we think our students are well qualified to provide integrated services to both mental health and substance use clients without additional credentials or training. Okay, it's time for audience questions, and we have a couple questions here to share with the panel. The first question to the panel is, can you speak to the unique need for integrated care for older adults?
I think that's a great point, and I'll use a personal example at this point. The last time I went home to go visit my family, I went to go see my grandmother, and she said, oh, can you go grab my pills and my water for me? And I said, oh, sure, Grandma, no problem. And I picked it up, and I saw she was taking a medication for anxiety, and I went, that's weird. Last I checked, my grandmother hasn't been to a counselor, nor has she been to a psychiatrist. This is a relatively high dose. What's going on here? And I asked my grandma, you know, I played dumb. What's this one for? And she's like, no idea. No clue. She had no clue what she was taking, why she was taking it. I think she actually thought it was for her diabetes. And I was like, all right, Grandma, can you maybe sign a little release so I can talk to your doctor? And I think there's a lot of times they are just getting treated by their physician, and there is so many needs for our growing population, things that happen later in life that aren't properly addressed. There are stressors that occur, whether it be having to move to a nursing home or losing a partner, losing friends, losing loved ones, moving back in with your child, maybe having a sandwich generation happening where you've got the 3 generations in the household. That's going to bring a lot of stressors, and the result is, oh, I'm feeling sick, so I'm going to go to my primary doctor, and I'm not going to go any further than that. And I think breaking down those walls of how helpful mental health can be for our aging population is critical, and we're not doing a good enough job on it.
I would agree with all those things, and I also think that an added complication is the generational idea that counselors, I don't need a counselor, I don't want a counselor.
I'm not crazy.
Yeah, there's nothing wrong with me. I'm thinking about, again, I think we can probably all think about these individuals in our lives. I think about my grandmother who was, raised in the Depression. This is a person who will fix her own problems. She does not want any help from anybody. And
needing or having somebody to speak with her, whether it's an actual counselor that maybe resides at her physician's office that would be able to pop in and see her, or really getting better at, and I'll just throw this out there, and this may be controversial in and of itself, training physicians in order to be able to provide some of this, or at least be better at some things.
Figuring it out.
Yeah, yeah. Because I definitely think about my own, who I use in my classes all the time about, let's talk about my grandma today.
Well, I think you bring a great point about better training physicians, because I think it's, and forgive me if I'm wrong on this statistic, but I think it's 3 out of 10 physicians diagnose correctly when it's in regards to mental health care. And that's alarming, knowing how many, just in general, our entire population go and seek that guidance from their primary care physician. That's, to me, terrifying that, there needs to be some training on that side as well.
I would agree. I also, my history is that my mother was a prescriber while she was living. She was a nurse practitioner, and anytime she would say to me, oh, I saw a patient and I prescribed an antidepressant or something, and I say, did you also refer to a counselor? Because that's where I'm coming from. And her answer was often no. And the no really was because they lived in such a small town that there were no mental health professionals. And so part of that may also be recruitment by doctors' offices in smaller towns, or again, cross-training. And so, I know that opens up a completely different conversation and a lengthy conversation, but I think that, I think it's really crucial. Yeah, because they don't just need counselors and doctors, they need, occupational therapists, physical therapists, recreational therapists. I would even argue they need, on some level, gym time and personal trainers to be able to move. So I think there's a lot that goes into, especially working with the elderly population.
It feels like recently we've had quite a few students that had an interest in our older, wiser folks that are in our midst. And I remember we also require for our clinical classes that they have 4 hours of volunteer work in the community. And so they'd say, can I go to a nursing home? And I'd be, you should do that. And one of them was like an exercise class. And so I remember the student talking about, I went in there with such judgments about their needs for mental health. I went in there thinking, I can keep up with them, or, I'm going to engage with them for 4 hours and this is going to be easy peasy. And she's like, it was not, right? They could out-exercise me, right, number one, but their desire or interest to just talk about their families, right? Like we think of that relational piece that's so good for our clients when they come in. It's the same thing for our older generation, our older, wiser generations, for them to be able to talk about their settings and their history, like that's healing in and of itself. So I think maybe as a collective group, we don't do a good enough job working with that population, but I think there are students that just kind of naturally want engagement with that population. I think we have to keep supporting that. So, yeah, good question. Thanks for asking.
Yeah. One of the things that I noticed with our students, since 2008, with our big recession that we had, our financial crash, we've had younger and younger students coming into our programs. I'm sure you guys have too. And they are terrified of older people. I have a segment in my culture class about working with older people and stereotyping, and they're like 3/4 of them are really frightened unless they have someone in their life who is older. So that's one sort of barrier that we have to get through from the student perspective. From the client perspective, so many of our integrated behavioral health care facilities serve minority populations, immigrant populations. I just converted one of my students' dissertations into a journal article, and one of the things that she found is the difficulty, the stigma, of course, associated with getting professional mental health services, because they still have the same mentality we had in this country 50 years ago about what it means to get help, what is mental health. And so many of them think of it as medical issues or karmic issues or spiritual, that they should go to their spiritual advisor. So having to work through to get them in. And then a second piece is because, at least in California, with integrated behavioral health, we're serving a low-income population, and transportation is always a difficulty, right? Because there's a lot of people who are in the geriatric population have lost their driver's license and may not feel comfortable navigating the bus system. In California, we have really crappy transportation, right? Everybody owns a car. So that's another layer that I think negatively impacts their ability to come. The need is there, there's no doubt. But getting them to us, or even if we could go to them, that's difficult because there's not enough students who want to do the work, and then there are not enough elderly people who are interested in getting it done. But gosh, the need is really powerful.
Yeah.
It's interesting you said the stigma, because my mom's fairly young still, and she'll say, "You're the only counseling I need. You're the only counseling I need." Oh, where's your granddaughter?
Yeah, I would agree with that. I would say maybe, I mean, we've had students who are interested, you know, in working with older adults, but that's a low percentage, I would say. 5% or less, you know, every year. And that's something for us to pay attention to, I think, particularly if you have students who are interested in working in integrated care settings, particularly primary care settings, where the vast majority of clients are usually older adults, because that does play into it. The other piece that I'll mention is a structural issue, which is part of the reason why it's hard for us to train students to work with older adults is because we don't have Medicare. We can't bill Medicare right now.
Right.
And I think that in itself is a major dilemma facing our profession, which is if we don't get recognition status as a provider under the Medicare system, you have to wonder how that's going to impact hiring if we're going to be assuming here that integrated behavioral health care will become a norm rather than fade away. If it becomes a norm, then it'll be hard for agencies to employ, if they have competing candidates, to employ someone who cannot bill Medicare versus another candidate who can, just because that's going to impact reimbursement for that organization.
That's why we have to write our senators and all those Republican senators and say it's cheaper to hire us. Wouldn't you rather hire us than a psychologist? We're way cheaper.
Yeah. So that's a great point, Leah, which is, I think we need to do a lot of grassroots advocacy, and it's not going to be easy because whenever you change Medicare by adding new providers, it costs the system money because you're providing more services. And of course, the Medicare system is infamously, there are issues with funding it. So there's a concern about the Medicare system becoming even more pricey and less sustainable long term. So it's not an easy sell, but it's something that we can get more engaged in, I think. Do you all have courses in older adults, counseling older adults? We have one specialization class that's an elective that we don't have many students who take it, but it's there.
No, we integrate it throughout, you know, maybe a third of our courses, but it's not enough.
It comes up in my culture class. However, as I'm sitting here thinking about it, it's a chapter at the end of the book, and it ends up it's one of those topics that, as we talk about it, if time doesn't allow, then I'll say, make sure you go over this and let me know if you have questions, and remember, like, so I'm just trying to think here, it's not a focus, right? It's not as big of a focus as it needs to be.
I do an exercise actually in my culture class. I integrate disability and age, even though I separate them when I lecture on it.
Yeah.
But my experiential activity is I blindfold half the class.
Yeah.
I take half the class out. The people who've had experiences with elderly people stay in the room, and then the other half goes out. In the room, I tell them, you're blind, you're old, and you're cranky, and you're in a facility. And, you know, act like the grumpy, and then you can be the I can't hear you well, or repeat your old stories, or they're out to get you. And then I go tell the other, you're going to go pick up your elderly client, and they have to leave the room. And I see them pick them up and grab their arm, and I'm like, whoa, slow down, you know. So we do a little bit of that and then process it. And it's really powerful. It helps in that class. But we also talk about it in development. And
I wanted to share one other thought on something we were talking about, and then we're going to have the summary of today's presentation. We're almost out of time. I think that the other piece to training that we can look at, in my opinion, outside of older adults, which I think is a very important component of training that we probably could look at, you know, how are we going to do that better? I think in our addictions coursework, especially, Things like how to handle opioid addiction is a big issue, and working with doctors, how to talk to them about opioid addiction, just because it's such an epidemic in this country. So I think that's another piece that you're probably all doing as well, is having that conversation with students about that issue. Okay, I think we're at the point where we're going to have kind of a summary of today's panel presentation. So Chris Cleaver is going to come up and provide a kind of summary of the panel today, and then we will close the panel presentation.
We'll see what I can do here, see what my best effort is. Thank you so much for all that you've shared today. All right, this is what I got. Excuse me. In the current climate, which may change dramatically in January, there has been a growing yet disparate focus on integrating mental health care with medical and other types of care in the Western region. The challenges of preparing counselors to work with clients in integrated behavioral health care settings include some of the following. How does the state climate, including law as well as the scope of counselors and other mental health professionals, impact counselors' engagement in integrative behavioral health care settings? How can we protect a counselor professional identity and meet the case management responsibilities that interns and counselors engage in? When, how, and how explicitly do we engage in conversations with students about collaborative care? For instance, who will they collaborate with? What do these conversations look like? How do counselors advocate for their clients and their services, and also communicate respect for other service providers, their scope, and their experience? Using role plays may be helpful to accomplish some of this skill development. Also, in what settings will these conversations take place, and how will the setting impact those conversations? Providing opportunities for students to understand the climate of medical and other facilities might be helpful in order to implement strategies such as brief interventions that are congruent with integrated behavioral health care models. Training students to educate and influence service providers about helpful counseling strategies that we ourselves are trained to employ that can improve the service provided by medical and other healthcare providers. In other words, we have a lot of skills and strategies that are helpful, we found to be helpful, and we can also maybe educate and influence other service providers to use those strategies. It might also be helpful to educate students about psychopharmacology in order to be better conversant with medical and other service providers. How might the length of interventions or sessions, if you use that term, be influenced by the particular setting, approach, and client needs? Who are the clients that counselors are likely to help in integrated behavioral health care settings? So those are all considerations as we train counselors, as we work as supervisors in helping people, our students and supervisees to prepare for working in these types of settings. Panelists have also found that an emphasis on the following has been helpful: advocacy, a systems orientation, focusing on holistic health, understanding the providers and the settings, as well as an emphasis on multicultural and social justice competency, which could include different cultural backgrounds, uses of language, socioeconomic status, immigrant status, age, and ability status. Furthermore, counselors need to engage in consultation and rigorous training in order to work with clients experiencing substance abuse disorders, eating disorders, and other conditions. This rigorous training should demonstrate the competence and credibility of counselors working in integrated behavioral healthcare settings. And then finally, in addition to training considerations, there also appears to be a great deal of work to clarify with stakeholders within various states about who counselors are, what their training is, who they are trained to serve, and how their scope is either similar or dissimilar to that of other mental health care providers. This clarification may lead, and hopefully would lead, to decreased stigmatization of seeking counseling and also greater utilization of counselors in integrated behavioral health care settings.